communities.
Recorded across the municipality's 4 villages and 9 manors. 111 demolition decisions were executed, including cases from before the law were executed.
People who build on agricultural land now face up to 5 years in prison and a fine of up to $280,000. Before the law was revised in January, the top fine was $2,800 and the prison term wasn't specified. Authorities say they want to end unlicensed building on farmland, reduce overcrowding, and provide homes for the poor. But analysts say many new government housing projects are too expensive and have poor services.
Definitely, building violations will impact the productivity of agricultural crops. Violations are not just measured on the scale of one municipality, but you measure them in comparison to all municipalities across the country.
According to data from the Ministry of Agriculture, nearly 85,000 acres of farmland have been lost to illegal construction. That's a 40% average annual increase compared to before 2011. Of those 85,000 acres, 28,000 have been cleared of buildings, but most is not being farmed. The government has started a campaign to demolish unlicensed buildings from 19,000 acres of farmland. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
Right then, let's do a deeper dive into this particular story. Yasser Hakim joins us now live from Cairo with more data on this. So Yasser, I guess it would make sense to start with setting the base here. So give us an overview of the housing situation in Egypt, particularly in urban areas. What's the size of a typical 3-bedroom house, or rather the price of a typical 3-bedroom house compared to average incomes? And why is housing out of reach for so many?
Well, Rama, if you talk about the urban areas or the areas where there's a lot of agriculture, they build the houses on land, on agricultural land, so it's extremely haphazard. And it's also looks like bricks making a house. It's not something that you feel that is well thought of or well architectured, and therefore the kind of size is like 80 to 100 meters squared. For an apartment, for a family, small family, and obviously if you compare it to the income, they're just building it themselves, but at the cost, at their own means, especially when it's without being illegal, without any licenses. In the cities and the areas where it's been legalized, of course, and you can build and licensed, the expenses can be the same size, would be like 4 or 5 times the price. Obviously over budget for any income here, especially the low income and medium income, which is like 90% of the population. So the issue here is a complicated issue concerning the real estate industry and how it tries to prices of houses increased by 200 and 300% in 3 years and so forth. So it's very, very profitable. If you have some money, you buy an apartment and then you sell it next.
Debt rot.
The biggest shareholder that Eskom has is the Public Investment Corporation.
We had a shortage of supply for allocation to the fuel sector, some logistical challenges, but those are being resolved. So you should see the fuel supply improved over the next few days.
Earlier this month, gold miners were allowed to retain 55% of their export proceeds in hard currency, up from 30%. The move is aimed at keeping them in production, earning more foreign currency to help the cash-strapped government balance its books, something it's recently managed for the first time in years.
We have balanced the budget deficit in the month of September and in the month of October. I can say this. In fact, in the month of October, we have a primary surplus. We are the first to hear this, a primary surplus of $29 million. This is the first time it's happened in the longest while. Of course, we have interest to pay from previous debt that then pushes us into a small negative, but the budget is as good as balanced.
Cost-cutting measures are set to intensify in the new year. However, they won't include large-scale retrenchments in the civil service, which have been deferred to a later date when the Treasury can afford exit packages.
It's not viable for government at the moment, and neither is it sustainable at the moment for government to consider redundant at this particular moment in time.
The Treasury forecasts clearing debts owed to international lenders over the next 12 months and reducing its fiscal deficit to 5% during the same period on the back of austerity measures proposed in its 2019 budget. Farai Mwakutuya, CGTN, Harare, Zimbabwe.
China's ambassador to Egypt and the country's former Prime Minister SM Sharaf have relaunched the Belt and Road Initiative in a seminar in Cairo. Bilateral ties and trade really between these two countries have grown quite a bit, and China's investments in Egypt now stand at nearly $7 billion. The level and the number of non-governmental interaction between the two countries has also been on an upward trajectory. More than 300,000 Chinese tourists visited Egypt last year alone. The Belt and Road Initiative is a development plan adopted by the Chinese government that involves infrastructure development and investments in countries in Europe, Asia and Africa. At the same time, the commercial office of the Chinese embassy in Egypt has held its annual media conference in Cairo. The ministry's councillor, Han Bing, has introduced the 8 major action points of the China-Africa Cooperation Forum Summit in Beijing. He also spoke about the first China International Import Expo and the China-Egypt Economic and Trade Cooperation Summit in 2018. He said the two countries will work together to work on the 8 major action points from FOCAC. Next year, remember, Egypt will hold the rotating presidency of the African Union, and that should play a greater role in promoting Sino-African ties. The two countries signed 12 cooperation agreements worth about $18.3 billion. Bilateral trade has continued to grow, and the scale of Egyptian agricultural exports to China has also expanded. All right, then time for a short break on the program. Here's what's coming up next. Preparations are in high gear ahead of the G20 summit this weekend. We'll also take a look at the Herculean task that awaits world leaders when they meet to talk about climate change next month.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. Let's recap the stories making you headlines at this hour. Starting in Nigeria, President Muhammadu Buhari has been addressing the nation on the state of security in the north. In his one-day visit to Maiduguri, that's in the northeast, the president promised to seal loopholes in the security sector. He also said his government will procure modern military equipment for the army. The United States has imposed a travel ban and frozen the assets of the former Ethiopian intelligence chief Getachew Assefa. He is accused of orchestrating the assassination attempt on Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali in June. The charges against him include crimes against humanity on thousands of prisoners right across the country. 19 people have died of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's according to the country's health ministry. The deaths occurred in just 5 days. It marks nearly 4 months of this deadly outbreak in the eastern end of the DRC. The outbreak that started on the 1st of August has so far claimed over 240 lives. And finally, Egypt is studying proposals to prevent families with 3 or more children from getting access to government subsidies. Members of Parliament are drafting legislation that would allow families with 2 children to get access to government grants and offer additional incentives to families with 1 child, and then block those with 3 or more children from getting access to any financial or in-kind state assistance. The country needs to limit its population to 112 million by 2030. That's a run through your headlines. On to matters further afield now. Russia's head of state Vladimir Putin says he hopes to meet his American counterpart Donald Trump at the G20 summit in Argentina to talk about trade barriers. The G20 summit is scheduled to start on the 30th of November, but it's still unclear at this point if a bilateral meeting between these two will even take place. Following the seizure of Ukrainian naval vessels by Russian forces earlier in the week, Trump indicated he may cancel the meeting altogether. Argentina is hosting the G20 Leaders Summit in Buenos Aires this week. Now, much of the focus will be on the sideline meetings between the heads of state, particularly a planned meeting between Presidents Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. The hosts are hoping that this summit may serve as a sort of turning point towards economic recovery. CGTN's Joel Richards gives us a preview of what you should expect.
Roger Rojas has been working for a food delivery app since arriving in Argentina from Venezuela earlier this year. He was able to start work immediately, but there is a downside to joining the so-called gig economy.
Sometimes you can be waiting for 4 hours for one job, which pays less than $2. You have to be available all day and out on the street.
Workers in this growing temporary work industry in Argentina have now put their collective foot down. They formed a new trade union to argue for better conditions. This is just one group of workers who have protested labour conditions and the economic situation in Argentina. Economic activity is down, unemployment is up, and inflation is hovering at around about 45% as we near the end of what has been a very difficult year for Argentina. The country has had to go to the International Monetary Fund for a $56 billion bailout. But the government does see the G20 as an opportunity. Argentina had hoped to show a very different image to the world as it hosts the first G20.
Economic conditions in Argentina are quite severe.
Many analysts see this G20 as a chance for Argentina to change the narrative.
So Macri popularity has been damaged during this year, and G20 is an opportunity for the government and for the president to shift the agenda, to start talking about other priorities of his policies, not only the economy, and that start showing that Argentina re-engagement in the world can pay off and can bring opportunities for Argentina society.
The formal agenda for the G20 summit is expected to focus on issues from development and food security to the future of work. But as host, Argentina offers a clear snapshot of the complex problems facing many economies around the world. Joel Richards, CGTN, Buenos Aires.
Now then, the G20 summit has a lot to actually get through, and trade tensions are going to be right at the heart of it. So let's get a bit more analysis on the topic from Washington, D.C. Daniel Rangers joins us now live from that city. So Daniel, as we wrap up 2018, what is the economic data telling us about the damage that is being done so far by the tariffs imposed by the US and China on their respective economies?
Here in the United States, the damage so far of the trade war's been relatively muted, and I think the key component of that is the strength of the dollar. So even though the US has raised tariffs on Chinese goods, because the dollar is strong, it means that US companies can basically buy the same products at the same price, even though they have these additional tariffs on. So it's really had a notable effect. And I think it's interesting that yesterday, Donald Trump gave an interview with the Washington Post where he ranted about Fed Chair Jerome Powell, who he appointed, raising interest rates and saying that undermined Donald Trump's work that he's doing to pump the economy further. And I think that's the major factor when it comes to the impact of these tariffs being relatively muted. But I think over time, economists say there will be a snowball effect. As interest rates rise here in the United States, or are anticipated to do so, plus the more muted impact of tax cuts that have provided a boost to the US economy, this is going to start to have a drag effect. And if there are additional taxes on US businesses in the form of a continuing tariff war with China and other partners, that will also have a drag effect. But for now, because the US economy has been relatively strong, you've not seen a notable impact. I think from the Chinese side, the fact is that people in Washington are looking at the level of debt the GDP in China and saying they think that provides the US with some additional leverage going into these talks.
Indeed. So Trump's tariffs on steel, though, because I remember that did cost GM, and it wasn't just GM, it was car makers like Ford as well. In GM's case, it costed about an extra $1 billion in cost, but they were being cited as one reason for its latest restructuring efforts. But in aggregate, how big a factor is it, considering everything else that's happening in the US economy, like changing driver habits, the use of ride sharing, and an expected slowdown in car revenues as well?
Well, it makes for a nice headline, the idea that steel tariffs are undermining the US auto market. But the fact is, the US auto market's revenue is around about $700 billion US. So although it might cost consumers a little more to have steel at a higher price, the fundamental issue that CEO Barra is dealing with here is the fact that a lot of these traditional cars just aren't selling very well. And instead, what they are finding is that these SUV cars combined with trucks are really the hot sellers. People want these kind of cars, and now that fuel economy has improved for these kind of larger vehicles, it makes it much more attractive for consumers. So Barra really is looking at trying to stop the production of cars that simply don't make the company very much money. The price of that is that there is a lot of political anxiety with the Trump administration touting its ability to continue to have better manufacturing jobs. This is not good for the Trump narrative, but in the long run, it's what GM needs to do.
Indeed. One last question for you, Daniel. The focus on tariffs has also obfuscated one of Washington's long-held complaints on intellectual property protections, especially for foreign firms operating in China. But at this point, is it too late for any progress to be made on resolving that issue? Because one, the US has alienated key allies, and two, it's also basically hobbled or crippled the WTO.
Yes, it's a very complex strategic issue here. I think a lot of people, if you look on social media, are fond of saying, well, Donald Trump is unpredictable, he's a little bit insane. That's what people are saying, right? But in a sense, that provides Donald Trump with some leverage going into things, because he can go to China and say, you know, if you don't do A, B, and C, then I'm going to continue to perpetuate this trade war, and I don't care. Whatever I do with conviction. That provides him with some leverage, whether or not it's intended. And it's certainly the case with intellectual property, that previous presidents have been focused on incremental change, knowing how important their relationship with China is. But this is a president who is not fond of incremental change. He wants the big deal. It remains to be seen whether China's going to play that game in the long run. But certainly I think this is coming to a head, and both sides seem to be indicating that they do want to resolve some of these issues moving forward.
Indeed, we'll have to leave it there for the time being. Thank you for that. That's Daniel Rangers there live in Washington, D.C. And I'd like to pick up on one of the elements of the conversation you just had, more on General Motors' plans to idle 5 factories in North America. The company also is cutting about 14,000 jobs in an effort to trim costs. CGTN's Dan Williams has a story from Detroit.
After more than 30 years of operation, the decision by General Motors to halt production at its vast Detroit Hamtramck assembly plant has caused shock. Cars produced here over the years include the Cadillac Eldorado and the Chevrolet Volt. But that now looks set to end. At stake are 1,500 plant jobs, plus many more down the line, suppliers and other local businesses. For the community, the news is devastating.
If it's going to close down, imagine it's going to be very, very terrible for my business and business local.
In all, GM is idling 5 factories in North America, cutting roughly 14,000 jobs in a bid to trim costs. GM says the action allows the company to stay ahead of a fast-changing market, with experts predicting a slowdown in car sales in the coming years.
The driving force by these moves is to cut costs. GM had 1 million of the 3.2 million units in unused capacity in the United States. That is an astonishing amount that they needed to cut down if they wanted to remain profitable in that downturn and also continue to invest in those future technologies.
A further issue for automakers is the rise in the cost of production. The global trade dispute has led to an increase in the cost of metal imports, putting a further strain on the industry.
Despite that, the automotive industry has enjoyed a bullish few years.
See, this is where it gets complicated because the health of the car industry is actually extremely good. And I mean, we've been seeing 17 million vehicle sales. Automakers are recording record profits, which is why it's so difficult for some people to understand why GM, Ford, and other automakers are making cuts right now.
There is still time for GM to change its strategy, but until then, workers here are facing up to a gloomy future. Dan Williams, CGTN, Detroit.
The American president is unrelenting in his criticism of the Federal Reserve chairman that he appointed, Jerome Powell. President Donald Trump says that rising interest rates and other Fed policies, in his view, are damaging the American economy. The Washington Post is quoting Mr. Trump as saying in an interview that he's not even a little bit happy with his selection of Jay, as he referred to the man he picked last year to lead the Fed. In recent months, the Republican president has repeatedly, heatedly criticized Powell and the Fed's interest rate hikes. Trump says increases are making it more expensive for his administration to finance its ever larger deficits. 3 years after sealing a landmark global climate deal in Paris, world leaders will be gathering yet again to agree on the fine print in Katowice in Poland from the 2nd of December. Now, the euphoria of 2015 has given way to the grim realization that getting an agreement among nearly 200 countries, each with their own political and economic demands, will be very, very challenging. For proof of this, look no further than President Donald Trump's decision to pull the United States, one of the biggest carbon emitters, out of the Paris Accord. At the top of the agenda, the meeting in Poland will be finalizing the so-called Paris Rule Book. This will determine essentially how countries determine the size of their greenhouse emissions, transparently report them to the rest of the world, and then say what they are doing to reduce them. That meeting is expected to draw some 25,000 participants.
In Paris, we decided that everybody is going to contribute to this new system. So no exceptions, everybody is doing something. And the Paris Rulebook is actually about how we are going to contribute to that. Obviously, not all countries are at the same stage of development and capacity building. So we need to also take that into account and differentiate between the responsibilities. And that's a huge task.
Everyone recognize that the national plans, when you add everything up, will take us way beyond 3, potentially 4 degrees Celsius warming. So these national plans have to be revised and updated. And we know scientifically that we have to bend the global curve of emissions no later than 2020, so just the year after Katowice. We know that we're moving in the wrong direction. So 2018 and 2019 are decisive years for all countries in the world to revise their plans and really start implementing decarbonization policies and pathways.
All right, then let's make a quick run through commodity prices. Saudi Arabia's oil minister, he was in Nigeria today to meet his opposite number over there. They held a joint briefing a little later. And Nigeria's oil minister, Emmanuel Ibekachiko, he said it was way too early to indicate if they would join into any production cuts. Although the question then becomes, can they actually pull it off at this point? That's still an open question. Still, rising output from the US and a slowdown in GDP growth around the world, those have combined to dampen demand forecasts for oil. And that in turn has partly triggered the steep fall in oil prices from a high of $85 a barrel in October. Welcome back. Zimbabwe's agriculture program, known domestically as Command Agriculture, seems to have started to bear fruit. With the rainy season finally coming, stakeholders are confident that the country will have enough food production under the program.
Zimbabwe is an agriculture-based economy but has in recent years struggled to maintain production levels due to drought and economic challenges. The government has since implemented the Command Agriculture program. The aim is to combat effects of climate change and mitigate food security concerns. It seems to be bearing fruit.
you find that because of the yields which came out of command, you find that the country actually managed to surpass the estimate. Because at the moment, if you look at our grain storage, we've got more than enough. So in terms of bread basket for Zimbabwe, yes, we are self-sustainable at the moment, and we are looking in the near future.
The rainy 2018-2019 rainy season has begun. Most farmers are busy preparing their land for planting. President Emerson Mnangagwa is on record saying that the country's agriculture must be modernized, merchandised, and put under irrigation to ensure good harvests even during periods of drought. And the government will support that as it seeks to reclaim its position as the breadbasket of the continent.
You definitely find that in the short term, we'll actually retain that status as, again, that will be able to export and feed Africa, if not the world. Because we've got the potential, we've got the technocrats are here, the technical know-how, it's here. So the soil, we've got very good soils, and the water we've got. So there's nothing which can stop us from regaining the status.
Command Agriculture was introduced at the start of the 2016-2017 farming season. It came with funding, which was a major constraint for farmers, and other inputs such as seed, fertilizer, fuel, mechanization, and tillage. The program has expanded to include small grains and has also broadened its spectrum to livestock, cotton, and other farm produce. Although it was a product of the controversial land reform program, it seems to have brought some normalcy to land distribution issues and land usage. Dina Matengo, CGTN.
Deforestation is a significant problem in Nigeria. The country lost in a country where
his business.